Good morning, everyone. We're so happy to have you here today for this climate justice webinar. Thanks so much for taking the time, and thanks especially to our panelists for being here. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place in many places. I am speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Our panelists will tell you where they are calling in from today. This webinar is brought to you by the UBC Sustainability Initiative and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. A few logistics first. The event is being recorded. I will say a few words of welcome and introduction, and then introduce the first panelist who will give a talk, followed by a brief question, and then on to the next three panelists, leaving time for a group discussion at the end. Please use the Q&A button for questions. So climate justice, we're so pleased to have these four wonderful panelists with us here today to talk about this critical issue. UBC Professor Catherine Harrison, UBC Scholar and Counsel to the Haida Nation, Terri Lynn Williams Davidson, UBC Scholar Temitope Anifade, speaking to us from Nigeria today, also a scholar at the law school and a PhD candidate, and UBC alumni, Eugene Kung, who's a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. I will say a bit more about them before each of them speaks. We're talking about the critical issue of climate justice today and how it has such a disproportionate impact on different peoples and different countries around the world. The webinar asks, who does climate change impact most? And the panelists will also talk about who has caused climate change. The people experiencing the impacts are not the same as the people who have caused it. And just one statistic that might be quite shocking. Today, the richest 1% produce double the amount of the carbon emissions of the half of humanity income-wise. More than double those carbon emissions. Those numbers are from an Oxfam International report from 2020 called Confronting Carbon Inequality. It's both a global and a local issue. And here at UBC, climate justice is a big part of the UBC Climate Emergency Task Force report, which was endorsed unanimously in principle by the UBC Board of Governors just a few weeks ago. And we can talk more about that task force report later. Before I turn it over to introduce the first speaker, I want to explain the inspiration for the title today, the title of today's webinar. Listening to poet Amanda Gorman during President Biden's inauguration last month, one line in her poem, "The Hill We Climb," really stood out to me. Let's hear it now.
We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is.
Very powerful words. What just is isn't always justice. So true, especially for climate change. A shout out to poet Amanda Gorman and to my daughter Sophie for this inspiring title idea. And now I'd like to turn it over to the first of today's speakers, Professor Catherine Harrison. She teaches in the Political Science Department at UBC and researches the comparative politics of carbon taxes. She's the author of many articles and books, including one of my favorite titles and books, Passing the Buck, Federalism and Canadian Environmental Policy. And we still see that passing the buck continuing today. Professor Harrison is one of UBC's leaders on climate action. Thank you so much for being here, Kathy.
It is my great pleasure, and I'm joining you all from the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I think someone else is going to be getting my slides up on the screen. There we go. I want to get things started by giving a sort of 10,000 meter presentation of the many issues of climate justice. Climate change is fundamentally unjust in so many ways. The most obvious is the unequal impacts across generations, where past and the current generation have caused this problem that will be imposed without their consent on people who are not yet born. Unequal responsibility for the emissions that are in the atmosphere across countries and among people within countries. Unequal vulnerability to the consequences of climate change will affect some regions more than others, will affect some areas within countries more than others. Unequal capacity, particularly financial capacity, to adapt to the consequences of climate change that we're already experiencing and that will get worse. And the policies that we adopt to fix this problem also have the potential to create real differences in how they are distributed. We've also got challenges in terms of perceived differences in how those costs are distributed. And these inequalities are not random. They have geographic patterns, differences across sector, race, age, and gender. And so I want to give a high-level summary first at the global level, and then say a bit about the distribution of inequalities within Canada. Next slide, please. I'm not going to say a lot about the intergenerational justice because it's just so obvious, other than to say that we have seen this incredible movement of young people that emerged, has been kind of put on pause in the pandemic, that I think is one of the most impactful things that we have, that I have witnessed in the politics of climate change. Next slide. This is a map showing the percent of global emissions that individual countries account for. And we hear a lot about this one from various folks in Canada who argue that Canada only contributes about 1.5% of global emissions. Fact is, we're still one of the top 10 emitting countries in the world. And you can see that the US and China are the biggest two emitters, but there's an obvious problem with that. There's a lot more people in China than there are in the US. So another way to look at this is the average emissions per person of every individual within those countries. Next slide, please. That's what we're seeing on this quite different presentation. And suddenly Canada is one of the most emissions intensive countries per capita, along with the US, Australia, Saudi Arabia, for instance. And noteworthy that there are large regions of the world, obviously, most obviously in Central Africa, where the average person contributes less than 1 ton per year of emissions. The historical patterns up to now look quite similar as well, although some of the European countries rise a little higher because of their earlier reliance on fossil fuels. So uneven responsibility for the problem. Next slide, please. Then there's a question of who has the capacity to fix the problem and adapt to the problem. What this figure shows is on the y-axis, the CO2 emissions per capita, as in the previous map. On the x-axis, we've got GDP per capita as a measure of the average wealth of the countries. And what we see is that there's a pattern here in that the countries that are relatively wealthy have, to a large degree, gotten wealthy by causing climate change. So Canada, the US, Saudi Arabia, among the most carbon intensive countries in the world, but also among the wealthiest with the capacity to do something about it. China and India have large circles because that reflects their absolute emissions, but they're low in per capita emissions, low in per capita income. And I've included Chad in there. The emissions per capita in Chad are 0.06 tons per person, compared to about 16 in Canada. And the average GDP per person is $700 US. Next slide, please. Uneven impacts of climate change in different places in the world. Now, this will be a familiar slide from the most recent IPCC report, which shows that we're seeing greater warming at the poles and even cooling in some places. That's the blue. That doesn't really tell us what the impact of climate change is on people, though, because certain types of impacts affect people more. Next slide, please. A temperature increase in Canada in the winter doesn't hurt and actually may help reduce the number of deaths in some places, where in places that it's already hot, increasing the number of days above 35°C or very hot days will lead to more deaths. And what this figure shows is for the last 2 decades of this century, what the IPCC's projection is for the number of additional days above 35°C across the globe. And this is RCP 4.5, which is a mid-range IPCC projection. It's actually more ambitious than the current national commitments under the Paris Agreement from 2015. So this is not a do-nothing scenario. This is a scenario where we would see emissions level off around 2060, and we've got countries that will experience over 100 more hot days. Next slide. And that's particularly impactful because those countries, typically in the global south, already experience greater consequences of extreme heat. So we start seeing countries that have over 200 days per year, if you take what they're currently experiencing plus the additional over 35°C days. So Chad, in this case, will, in this scenario, would experience 270 days per year above 35°C. That has impacts on human health. Currently, 12% of residents of Chad have electricity. So unlike Canadians, they're not just going to flip the air conditioner on. And also can have devastating impacts on food production in places where there already are droughts and food shortages. In per capita terms, one of my own little numbers, not so little numbers, really disturbing one, is that the average Canadian surpasses the annual emissions of a resident of one of the 47 least developed countries, the annual emissions in 11 days. Next slide, please. So this is not news, and it is recognized in the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, Article 3, which was negotiated in 1992. The parties, and that refers to the countries that have signed it, should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Accordingly, the developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. That phrase in yellow, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, comes up a lot, as you can imagine, in international climate negotiations. So the expectation is that the countries that have contributed more to the problem should act first, and they also tend to be the countries that have greater respective capabilities to address the problem. So expectation that they will act first to reduce their emissions, and also over time, what has emerged is an expectation that they should contribute financially to assist countries that have lower emissions, less responsibility, less financial capability to develop on a cleaner path. And the route for that so far has been the Green Climate Fund. Next slide, please. So we've got good news and we've got bad news. The good news is that the countries who are most responsible for global carbon emissions also are the wealthiest and have the greatest capacity to fix this problem. The bad news is that countries that have the most responsibility tend to be less vulnerable. They are the countries in the global north that will not experience the same consequences as developing countries. And they also, by virtue of having already established carbon intensive economies, have the most to lose. They face the strongest political opposition. And for that reason, although we've got these lovely words in the UNFCCC, we haven't done that well in fulfilling those commitments. The Green Climate Fund did achieve the intended $10 billion of funding by 2020, but that is just a baby step of where we need to go, and we haven't seen those next steps yet. There is disagreement about funding, how much funding wealthy countries should be contributing to adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and that has taken the form of under Article 6, when there is emissions trading. Those rules are still being written. The idea is that a share of the proceeds, some of the profits, will be set aside to go towards adaptation. There's disagreement in how big that share of the proceeds should be. There is no agreement from wealthy countries that they owe money for the loss and damages that are caused by climate change, sort of liability for what they've done, as opposed to providing assistance with adaptation. Next slide. So far I've talked about these differences across countries, assuming averages within them, which we know is not the case. And in fact, all of the same arguments come out within Canada. Starting with a provincial comparison, these are the per capita emissions in different provinces. Two of them are not like the others. The per capita emissions intensity in Alberta and Saskatchewan is more than 3 times the national average by virtue of burning fossil fuels for electricity and producing fossil fuels primarily for export. Next slide. So within Canada, we see different contributions regionally and from different sectors, disproportionate impacts already being seen in the north, primarily Indigenous communities there, and also Indigenous communities on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction and transport. The income effects are more complicated. Wealthy people tend not to live at the fence of a refinery, so those who will benefit from reducing local emissions at the same time as greenhouse gases tend to be low income. But what we also see in Canada is, because so much of our greenhouse gas emissions takes place as a result of resource extraction in remote communities, that many of the people who are most affected and whose livelihoods are most at risk are actually above the median income in Canada. And I think that complicates the discussion about just transition in this country. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've used my time, and I guess we have time for a question, and then I'm looking forward to hearing my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Kathy, there's one question. There's a few questions, but the one I will pose to you is that your figures understate our actual climate impact because they ignore the emissions from fossil fuels we export and ignore the emissions necessary to produce our imports. I know that another panelist will be addressing that as well, but I wonder if you could just have a brief comment on that question, please.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point. There are 2 other ways of presenting these figures. One of them is based on consumption emissions. So countries import goods that were produced using fossil fuels and export goods. Canada's consumption emissions tend to be slightly higher than our combustion emissions. The other way to look at it is how much carbon are we producing that will be burned somewhere else in the world. And there, on net, Canada is exporting carbon emissions almost equivalent. I think it's about 75% last time I checked of the emissions that we are producing within our own country. So the scale of the coal, oil, and gas that we are producing contributes to almost another Canada somewhere in the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that overview. That was really set the stage for the rest of our discussion this morning. Now I'd like to turn it over and I will introduce Temi Tope Onifade to speak on climate justice in Africa. A very big topic, and we really appreciate it. Temi started as a lawyer in the notorious Niger Delta. He has had quite a career to date. He's lectured at Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador, and now researches low carbon regulation and governance as an international doctoral fellow and Vanier scholar in law at UBC. He's speaking us today from Nigeria, where it's early evening. Thanks, Temi, so much for adjusting your schedule to be able to be with us in Vancouver this morning and for making the time to speak with us today. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Linda. Hi, everyone, joining you from Ibadan, and I'd like to paint a picture of what climate justice means for Africa and why we should all take action. Africa is the biggest victim of climate injustice. I rely on scientists, but more importantly, I've decided to tell you the story of climate justice through pictures. Climate justice is really about painting a human face or putting a human face to climate change. Next slide, please. So I organized my presentation into three parts. Part one asks the central question of this conference: who does climate change impact most? To answer that question, I draw on my recent research to introduce three basic guiding questions in the literature. One, who is to blame for climate change? Two, who is more vulnerable to climate change? Three, who should be more responsible for climate action and for what? While acknowledging the many dimensions of climate justice, I use the Niger Delta story, one of the most notorious symbols of injustice in the world, to answer this question. So part two then goes beyond the Niger Delta to generalize on climate justice in Africa, focusing on how the main global instrument, the Paris Agreement to the UNFCCC, has responded. I think the Paris Agreement has taken climate justice from frying pan into the fire. Part three then identifies some of the global implications of climate injustice in Africa. Some people may think, well, why should I care about what's going on in Africa? I'll briefly tell you why you should care. So next slide, please. So let's start with part one. Who does climate change impact the most? If you look at the map on the screen, I'm from somewhere on the bottom left, a place called Oyo State. I went to a university in another place called Osun State, just beside Oyo State. While at law school, I didn't know much about the environment. After becoming a lawyer, however, I moved to Edo State towards the right of Oyo and Osun at the bottom of the map. I worked as a litigation lawyer at a law firm called GE Ezomo & Company, appearing across courts in Edo and Delta State, both within the Niger Delta zone. While living and working in the Niger Delta, I noticed multinational oil corporations operating in the region and governments marginalizing the indigenous landowners. Everyone wants a piece of the oil pie, but corporations and governments had most of the pie. Later, I went back to Southwest Nigeria and co-founded a law firm called Lex Luminaire. We had a regional client planting renewable energy feedstock, especially jatropha, so across Southwest Nigeria. And another client importing biodigesters to process biofuel. My partner and I sought incentives to support these local businesses, especially under the Kyoto Protocol. So we approached some government officials and eventually met with the board of one of the biggest investor corporations in Nigeria, the Odua Investment Company Limited. Well, we neither got the incentives from the government nor any deal from the corporation because renewable energy was just not on the agenda. So from my background story, you'd notice that my work at both the Niger Delta and Southwest Nigeria had something in common: corporations and governments that were not doing things in the interest of the people. So people had to fight for themselves. So my first major point on climate justice is that it is a movement largely driven by people at the grassroots to protect themselves. There's also the scholarly body of work, but I do not go into that today. So also from my background story, it may not be clear how my experience is about climate justice, right? It could just be environmental injustice. Let me clarify. What those corporations and governments are doing create immediate climate, environmental, health, and social impacts. But beyond that, they are also taking away the lands, water, air, livelihoods, and ways of life of those people. I'd like to show you some pictures to buttress my point. I'll also use the opportunity to answer those three questions I identified, or better, those sub-questions under the part one, about who climate change impacts most. Next slide, please. So this slide shows Ken Saro-Wiwa on the left and General Sani Abacha on the right. Saro-Wiwa was a human rights activist that fought for the liberation of the Niger Delta. Abacha was a military head of state leading the government that eventually sentenced Saro-Wiwa to death without fair trial. We can immediately get a sense of the role government could play in upholding or undermining climate justice from this Saro-Wiwa versus Abacha case. Next slide, please. So sub-question one, who is to blame? Imagine the picture on this slide shows your farm. That's where you plant the food you eat and sell to survive. I'm not pointing fingers, but you could see the source of that environmental destruction on the right of the screen that says shells, lines, spills, pollution and harassment of the locals. What does that tell you? Shell is probably the best known threat to the Niger Delta peoples. Things are changing now, but not everything lost can be regained. Next slide, please. Again, still on the same question, look at the picture on your screen. Imagine that's how you get to work every day, or that's how your children spend their time playing on the street. So much oil pollution to trigger all kinds of diseases. And there are no proper health facilities, right, to help out. Again, see who's to blame on the right side. Multiple oil spills by Ajib/Enning. Next slide, please. Now that we've established who to blame as governments and multinational corporations, I mean, there are others, but those are the two key parties. Let's move to the next sub-question. Who is more vulnerable? If you look at the screen, some women are taking care of the land. That is their culture. Imagine they are trying to plant crops there, or fetch firewood, or cook for their families on that land. Next slide, please. Also, traditionally, men are fishermen in the Niger Delta, as you see on your screen. There are exceptions, but that's what many of them do. See how black and polluted the river and the swamps are. I wonder what fish would survive there. Imagine families rely on fishing to survive every day, how they would feel. Next slide, please. And then imagine children drinking the water you see on the screen. You may see they hold bottles and bowls. Time for some refreshing oil water. I probably drank some of that oil water as well, but thankfully not for a long time. So what I'm trying to say basically is, from the Niger Delta story, we can see that multinational corporations and governments are more to blame for environmental and climate injustice. And we can see that women, children, young, hardworking men, and peoples indigenous to the Niger Delta are more vulnerable. I wasn't really vulnerable, or at least not for a long time, because I only lived there for a short time. But many of the Niger Delta peoples cannot uproot their families, heritage, and the memories of their homeland. Anytime I go back to Nigeria and visit where I grew up, imagine that's now a Niger Delta oil field. Will there be anything to go back to? Next slide, please. Now that we've established who is to blame and who is more vulnerable, the next question is who should be more responsible and for what? For the short-term environmental impacts, I think that governments and corporations should take responsibility, but they haven't. Beyond that immediate impact, we need to also deal with the short-term and long-term cumulative climate impact that the Niger Delta peoples and similar communities in Africa are dealing with, because they've lost their households, homelands, and livelihoods to oil and gas operations. They are unable to adapt to those impacts. That leads me to the global aspect of climate justice. So if you look at the table of top emitters on your screen, you'd see that the home country of the Niger Delta peoples, Nigeria, even though we have 200 million, is not on that list. Historically, industrialized countries have contributed the most to climate change. They should take major responsibility, and there's little doubt about that. That was what most governments and other stakeholders agreed to in 1992, when the global climate regime started. But that story has now changed somewhat, as the emphasis is now on the voluntary capacity of industrialized countries to help out least industrialized regions, such as Africa. So what is the solution? Many praise the Paris Agreement being the implementation instrument of the UNFCCC right now as a way forward. Yay. One reason is that it gives every country responsibility to contribute to climate mitigation, so we can all cut emissions and voila, we reverse climate change. In essence, the Paris Agreement shifted the emphasis of the UNFCCC away from the higher responsibilities of industrialized countries to help least industrialized countries. The emphasis is now on the responsibility of all countries. While that's great on paper, how would, for instance, Nigeria, still dealing with the challenges of the Niger Delta, feeding a growing population of 200 million people, struggling to have basic food, healthcare, and housing, and so on, take climate change seriously? Clearly, the Paris Agreement makes the problems of the global climate regime worse. I identify some of the other problems on the screen. For instance, it has a voluntary, next slide, please. It has a voluntary approach that does not ensure industrialized countries will make adequate contributions, provides poor financial transfer provisions, pays little attention to adaptation loss and damage, says little about the human rights implications of climate change and action, and maintains the government decision-making system, giving peoples and communities very little room to contribute. I don't have time to explain these, but I've written about them and I'm happy to chat about it. So next slide, please. So why is this a dangerous situation for the world? Why should the world be taking climate injustice in Africa and developing regions seriously? I have many answers, and right before COVID started, I made my case to President Sandra Ono and some other senior officials of UBC who are serving on the UBC Senate, and recently to folks handling Yale's University's Public Voices Fellowship on the Climate Crisis. Perhaps the biggest issue that I will single out is that whatever we're doing in Canada, Australia, US, Europe, New Zealand, wherever, will not work without addressing climate injustice in Africa. Let me buttress my point with the quotation you see on the screen from the IPCC. The largest mitigation opportunities with respect to human settlements are in rapidly urbanizing areas where urban form and infrastructure are locked in, but where there are often limited governance, technical, financial, and institutional capacities. Africa is the best example of that. There are other issues I identify on the screen, but I focus on this point on effectiveness. So what does this quote really mean? Well, Africa has the fastest growing population of young people crazy about urbanization. Most future urban settlements we know that will be in Africa as the continent of the future. Remember, we have just one climate, global climate. If the world does not address climate injustice in Africa now by providing adequate support, whether technical or financial or whatever, these young Africans will likely not take us seriously when we really need them to crown our global climate mitigation efforts. After all, Africa is just starting its journey of industrialization. So why shouldn't it have its fair share of dirty development? Some people may argue that Africa will be forced to embrace clean industrialization because it will be the cheaper option than dirty growth. That may be true, although we are not yet sure about that. But even if that's the case, Africa will have destroyed the climate so much in a short time. I mean, let's just think about China, right? I can tell you as someone who spends a lot of time in Africa every year, I'm there right now, governments and the private sector are still looking for new oil reservoirs. So the issue is not really about the existing ones. Coal would be great as far as Africans are concerned. So far, we have stable source of power. They can take this power anytime from now. Cement factories are becoming bigger with the richest black man, Nigeria's Aliko Dangote, investing across African countries. Everyone wants to build a house with adequate cement, metals, and materials. In my language, we say, meaning a house rich in cement. While at it, we are felling all the trees in our economies, in our forests to build those houses and do other things. After all, wants to live in a house or use the bridge made of weak wood. And wait, we are killing the bushmeat along the way too. Who cares about the biodiversity here, which is very important for climate change as well. So I can keep on going, but I have less than 2 minutes. So I'd like to stop there. Thank you very much for your time. And I thank Lynn for inviting me for this. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful overview. It's such a huge topic, and you did a wonderful job in a very short period of time. There's a bunch of questions about that aren't specifically addressed to the climate justice situation in Africa. So I will take the moderator's liberty and ask you a question based on your analysis of the Paris Agreement. And I know you have a good phrase for what the Paris Agreement has done for climate justice, but I wondered if you could just tell us what you think might happen with the upcoming Glasgow Conference of the Parties. Will climate justice be on the center stage for the next meeting of the climate treaty in Glasgow this fall?
Thanks so much for that question, Lynn. Yes, I do think so, or at least I hope so. I mean, climate justice is not a new concept, right? It first came on board, at least gained attention in the 1990s, especially 99. Then Track, an NGO in the US, now called, I think, Climate Corp, then popularized that term with a publication they made. So since that time, since 1999, we haven't done much about climate justice. In fact, if you try to look for publications, right, you have very few publications. I mean, serious scholarly work on climate justice. So based on this, I think that for the upcoming conference, climate justice is going to be one of the points, probably just because it's gaining some traction now. But I'm not very hopeful that they will go deep into the integrity, the really important aspects of climate justice, right? So it's not just about throwing words around or throwing principles around, common responsibilities, differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities. What do all these things mean for people in those communities? So that's what I'd like to see, not just some high level wordplay. So yes, I think it's going to be on the agenda to answer your question, but I don't think they're going to do justice to it or do climate justice to it.
Okay, thank you so much. Just in the interest of time, there are some really great questions piling up, but I think we're going to move to the next speaker now in order to have time for a discussion at the end and more questions. So it's my great pleasure to now introduce our next speaker, Terri Lynn Williams Davidson. She is counsel to the Haida Nation, an artist, and a master's student currently at UBC's law school. Like Temi, she's a research scholar with the Canada Climate Law Initiative. Terri Lynn is also a supporter of Lawyers for Climate Justice. She was one of the counsel in the landmark Supreme Court of Canada case of Haida Nation in 2004, leading to greater protection of Haida Gwaii old growth forests, successfully arguing to the court that to the Haida people, the cedar tree is considered to be an older sister. I'm very pleased to have you here today, Terri Lynn, and look forward to your comments on this topic of climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Linda, and thank you for the previous presenters for sharing your knowledge. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am on the beautiful territory, unceded territory of the Semi-Yamlu peoples here in southwestern British Columbia today. Now, I'm going to speak about climate change as a threat to Indigenous sovereignty and just build upon what has already been shared. I'm going to begin with a brief overview of Aboriginal title in Canada. I want to introduce the legal fictions that have dispossessed Indigenous peoples and continue to do so today, but also talk about an emerging new paradigm with respect to Indigenous peoples. I want to talk about the impacts of climate change on Aboriginal title and the Haida Nation and discuss what Crown obligations are to Indigenous peoples. And then I want to close by sharing some oral traditions and narratives from the Haida Nation that I think might help us in our struggle today in dealing with climate change. So beginning with Aboriginal title in Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada has confirmed that Aboriginal title vested in Indigenous peoples in Canada long before the Crown asserted sovereignty. And further, that Aboriginal title doesn't depend upon a treaty, an executive order, or legislative enactment. In other words, title is not something that is given to Indigenous peoples from the Crown. Rather, Aboriginal title includes the right to exclusive use and occupation of the land itself. I would say also the marine spaces that are part of Indigenous territories. Aboriginal title has an economic component, but also a significant non-economic component. Aboriginal title is to preserve a relationship of central cultural significance between Indigenous peoples and their lands and waters, and includes what the court called an inherent limit, which is essentially a sustainability limit. Aboriginal title is to protect our relationship with the lands throughout time, continuously from the past and going into the future, and therefore a sustainability limit. And finally, in relation to sovereignty, Aboriginal title confirms the right to determine the uses to which land, and I say waters, will be put, essentially a right to be involved in land and management of ocean spaces. Turning to the emerging paradigm, the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, called for the repudiation of concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. So this is the idea that European arrived into Canada and discovered vacant lands that were free for the taking. The TRC also called for the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, as a framework for reconciling the assertion of Crown sovereignty over pre-existing Indigenous sovereignty. UNDRIP contains the minimum standards for the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights. UNDRIP recognizes the historic injustices, colonization, and dispossession of Indigenous lands, territories, and resources, and the urgent need to respect the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. So coming back to the poem that we heard at the beginning, UNDRIP recognizes that this history of Canada has been about just us, excluding Indigenous peoples from justice in Canada. The provisions of UNDRIP that are relevant to Indigenous jurisdiction and sovereignty are Article 18, which recognizes the right to participate in decision-making in matters that would affect Indigenous rights, as well as the need to maintain and develop Indigenous people's own decision-making institutions because they have been impacted and run roughshod through the process of colonization. Article 29, which includes the right to conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of territories. And Article 34, Indigenous peoples have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their own laws, what we call Indigenous laws. One standard that is woven throughout UNDRIP is the free, prior, and informed consent. And relevant to climate change, that is the taking of lands, so FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, is required before lands and territories are taken. FPIC is required to develop redress mechanisms for the violation of Indigenous laws, traditions, and customs. FPIC is also needed for the adoption and implementation of any legislation or administrative measures that may impact Indigenous peoples. And finally, FPIC is required, it must be considered in the approval of projects that affect Indigenous peoples' lands or territories, such as large fossil fuel projects. Now, the reality in Indigenous territories is that very few Indigenous peoples have obtained the FPIC standard, even though globally it is the minimum standard of human rights. In litigation and negotiations, the Crown, both federal and provincial, are of the view that consent is only available upon proof of title through litigation or negotiation. In British Columbia, only one Indigenous nation, the Chilcotin, has proven Aboriginal title in litigation. That means that the rest, many Indigenous peoples, are left to resort to the Aboriginal law principles of consultation and accommodation, engaging the honor of the Crown. So how are Aboriginal rights impacted by climate change? I'm not going to go through all of the impacts. We've heard so much about that already, but I will say that climate change impacts access, use, and occupation of terrestrial and marine territories. Other Aboriginal rights are fundamentally impacted, such as the right to fish, the right to forest, the right to hunt, to gather medicines, and on and on. Floods, droughts, wildfires, melting of sea ice, rising ocean temperatures all lead to loss of species and food insecurity, affecting fresh water, which is a big issue here in Canada, ongoing species and medicines, all of which impacts the exercise of Aboriginal rights. Now, when I started as an article student in 1996, my fear was that we would get Aboriginal title to a massive clear-cut area of Haida Gwaii. That fear has then changed to gaining Aboriginal title to marine spaces that are devoid of marine species. And now this fear is that we will gain Aboriginal title, all Indigenous peoples, to barren territories. So then what are the Crown obligations to Indigenous peoples in respect of climate change? The Council of the Haida Nation brought the Haida Nation case that Linda introduced earlier because of this juridical terra nullius, this empty lands at law that happens before Indigenous peoples have the resources or the time to prove Aboriginal title to their territories. The Haida wanted to clarify what are the obligations of the Crown before Aboriginal title is proven. Surely, if the Crown has millions of documents in their own archives, is aware of a strong case for Aboriginal title, surely they can't proceed with their, in the case of the Haida Nation case, with replacing a large tree farm license to the heartland of Haida Gwaii. Among other things, the Supreme Court of Canada in the Haida Nation, and later in the Chilcotin case, said that accommodation requires the Crown to preserve Aboriginal interests pending final resolution. Now, these cases have defined a spectrum of consultation from mere consultation all the way up to accommodation. In the Haida Nation case, the court was clear that the Haida Nation's rights must be accommodated with respect to the forests. And at accommodation, projects need to change. The Crown has a much greater obligation to protect Aboriginal interests pending final resolution. Now, I posit that this duty of accommodation, especially in instances like the Haida Nation, where we are collaboratively managing 100% of the land base, our collaboratively managed marine spaces have been engaged in title litigation for over 2 decades, includes an obligation to protect Indigenous territories from the impacts of climate change. At the very least, that includes a duty not to make things worse, such as approving large fossil fuel projects, such as the Northern Gateway Pipeline Project or LNG projects, to help mitigate and adapt through funding of projects such as clean energy infrastructure. In places like Haida Gwaii, we're using dirty, outdated diesel for power. The implementation of storm protection systems. In Haida Gwaii, we often have hurricane force winds that are washing out roads and eroding our territory. To provide water protection systems in cases of drought. It's no longer uncommon here in coastal rainforests to experience periods of drought in the summertime. And while over 50% of Haida Gwaii is protected, and that this is not so much an issue for us, it is important for the Crown to establish Indigenous protected areas working directly with Indigenous peoples, as urged by the UN Commission on Human Rights. Now, the federal and provincial governments have created a standard for effective, productive governance over Indigenous protected areas through the Gwaii Trust model and the Great Bear Rainforest models, providing trust funds to build community infrastructure and Indigenous participation in a sustainable economy. Co-governance, like in Gwaii has directly incorporated the FPIC standard into decision-making structures, and that should be the standard that is used for other areas. Now, I want to close by sharing a few oral narratives from the Haida Nation. The UNDRIP preamble acknowledges that respect for Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices contribute to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment. In 2016, the Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Victoria Talley Corpez, emphasized the opportunities for Indigenous knowledge to help mitigate and adapt to climate change. She urged that we should not be viewed as victims of climate change without any agency. Globally, Indigenous peoples hold 80% of the planet's biodiversity, so clearly there is an opportunity to help mitigate and adapt to climate change. Now, one of the oral narratives, I would like to provide a glimpse into some of the oral narratives. These are very long stories, and so they'll be very brief here because of the time left. Now, in Haida Gwaii, we have witnessed and documented in our oral traditions the onset of 2 ice ages, the arrival of floods, and the arrival of trees to Haida Gwaii. As a maritime people, we are born from the oceans. After the flood over Haida Gwaii actually emerged from the oceans out out of the oceans came Haida Gwaii. And one of the first areas to emerge was a reef called Chagya. And it came out of the ocean like a reef in a falling tide, just beautifully lifting out of the ocean. And when Chagya emerged from the waters, Skulujat, or foam woman, was standing on top. And she sang a beautiful song to abate the flood that said, people saw dry land when they were afraid of anything so great. And the dry land, of course, was the land that was emerging from the flood. Haida Gwaii was emerging out of the oceans. And it was, that line refers to the time when the supernatural beings occupied Haida Gwaii and all they had was a reef in the middle of the ocean. Humanity was watching this and feared the power of Skulujat and the emerging land. Yet without Foam Woman, we would not have a future on this earth. We wouldn't have had a place to live. We would not have survived in the ocean realm without Skulujat. In other narratives, there are female supernatural beings that are the keeper of the tides. They protect the seafood in the low tide areas. There are keepers of the salmon in the rivers and streams throughout Haida Gwaii. Throughout our history, the supernatural beings have helped humans adapt and survive on this earth. Knowledge of the supernatural beings was suppressed in colonization, and their knowledge is surfacing in our consciousness again. Elder Gwaganut Diane Brown has advised that with greater knowledge comes greater responsibility. The supernatural beings return to us today to remind us of our obligations to protect the earth from the impacts of our own actions, the actions of every single one of us. In another narrative, Volcano Woman came to warn a village of a volcanic eruption that would destroy the community because they breached the law of respect to a frog, among other things. Now, the problem is that the realm of the supernatural being, the earth and the oceans, is threatened by climate change today. And so now we step into this role today to be the guardians, to be the warners of the impact of climate change to the rest of the population. And I encourage, and I'm happy that there are so many people here today who can step in and start finding ways together to find a solution to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terri Lynn. That was wonderful, like the other speakers. And I have to recommend to everybody Terri Lynn's wonderful book, Out of Concealment, in which she inhabits the spirit of the supernatural beings from Haida Gwaii in her art practice, and the book documents some of these stories. So I highly recommend that you look for that book to learn more about these supernatural beings. One question for you. I'm looking at the Q&A, and you can upvote questions. Everybody watching out there, please feel free to add a question, but also upvote a question. And I'm going to take the top one, which just changed. So we will go to this very central question about racism and its connection to the broader conversation on climate justice. The complacency, neglect, and refusal to take responsibility for contributing the most to the climate crisis is rooted in systemic racism and impacts experienced in the global South and among Indigenous communities in the West. We have to address institutional racism if we are to adequately address the climate crisis. And I just wonder, that's more in the form of a comment, but I wonder if you could comment on that concept and the relationship between racism and climate justice. I think your talk did do that, but I wonder if you could just say a bit more on that topic.
Yes, of course, that is a great solution, and racism is present in the challenge of protecting Indigenous people's rights, not only with respect to climate change, but Indigenous rights in general. And I guess I'll just say that.
Thank you.
Big question.
It's a very big question, and sometimes a simple answer. We'll have time to explore these links more when we come to the discussion among all the panelists. Thank you so much. So I would like to now move to our next final panelist, Eugene Kung. Eugene is a UBC alumni from the Political Science Department, and I believe he may have had some encounters with Professor Catherine Harrison in his time at UBC. He worked at the BC Public Advocacy Center and is now a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, where I had the great pleasure of working with him for a number of years before joining UBC. Eugene is an active community volunteer with many social justice organizations, and currently his work focuses on stopping the Trans Mountain Pipeline and Tanker Project, together with many others, including a client he works with, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. Over to you, Eugene.
Thank you so much, Linda, for the introduction. And thank you to the previous speakers for setting out in such a clear way the challenges that we face when it comes to climate justice, from the global scale, as we've heard, to the regional here in BC. And I'm going to kind of continue that and maybe try to pull some threads together from those discussions and focus on kind of what that question that was just asked brought up, which is the role of systemic racism in all of these, in particular with examples here in BC. So I'm joining you today from my home in the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I'm really happy to have been invited to this to kind of share some thoughts and reflect on some of my own experiences and some of the things that are going on. I, as you heard, was a graduate of UBC in the political science department, and indeed asked Professor Harrison back in the day to bring forward a political science environmental politics class, and I'm really pleased to know that that's happening now, and was really honored to be able to speak to that class earlier this year. I have other connections to UBC as well. My grandfather has a scholarship in his name, and that was because he was one of the very last head taxpayers to arrive in Canada, arriving just a month before the head tax was replaced by the Exclusion Act, which prohibited almost all forms of migration from China. And in the apology and some of the compensation that resulted from that, our family decided to create a scholarship at UBC under his name. It's called the Kwon Scholarship. It's a modest scholarship, but it's there. And I think for me, I want to mention that because in spite of the fact that my family arrived under clearly racist laws grounded in an ideology of white supremacy, that we have still benefited from colonization. And this is one small way to recognize that. So we've heard a bit about climate justice issues on a global scale. We've heard as well about how they disproportionately impact those who are the least responsible and most vulnerable to the impacts with the least ability to change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples here in BC, very obvious ones, including the Coastal GasLink, Trans Mountain, and Site C, which have been in the news quite a lot. These are all projects of the state forcing energy infrastructure without the free, prior, and informed consent of all impacted nations, and justified in the public interest. And this is where the systemic piece comes in. You heard in my bio that I'd spent some time at the BC Public Interest Advocacy Center, where I represented low and fixed income ratepayers of BC Hydro, Fortis Gas, and Pacific Northern Gas before the BC Utilities Commission. And I want to talk a little bit about how the systemic and legal tests that are set out in the way that we review these projects reinforces these dynamics that we've been hearing about. So in these, as I just mentioned, these often the violation, infringement of Indigenous rights, the impacts, adverse negative environmental impacts that are often part of large industrial projects are justified by the public interest. And so what does the public interest mean? This is a big question that, of course, requires constant balancing of various interests, and that I would suggest is constantly changing as well over time. And what it's meant to do is to balance it, but what in practice it's really done is privileged and advantaged a specific type of economic development and benefit, and have all of those other negative impacts kind of justified from that. And we saw that clearly in Trans Mountain, of course, most recently. And there's a built-in structural challenge to this that I want to talk about a bit more. I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of discrimination in human rights law, right? And the fact that you cannot discriminate on someone based on a number of enumerated grounds, including race, gender, place of origin, and so on. Well, that law, the concept of discrimination in law, actually shared a common pathway with the original utilities regulation, with the regulatory bodies that looked at natural monopolies like railroads, for example. And the concept of discrimination within that context actually diverged quite a lot from what we now understand as discrimination in the human rights context, and still persists today. You heard Kathy talk a little bit about intergenerational equity and the inequities that climate change represents. That concept also exists within regulatory law in terms of setting rates and collecting the fees, the funds to pay for infrastructure. But it's actually been used in a quite regressive way, in my opinion. In fact, the kind of notion of non-discrimination has been interpreted to say that you cannot treat one rate class differently from another rate class, whether that's residential customers, industrial customers, commercial customers, or then within the residential customer class, those who are, for example, low income. And even though energy in BC is some of the cheapest in the world, we still have huge amounts of energy poverty, which is where families or households spend a disproportionate amount of their disposable income on energy to heat their houses, for example, or keep their food fresh and healthy, which in our society is a basic necessity, I would suggest, for a healthy lifestyle. And so we know with certainty that there are people who are struggling. I think some of the events in Texas recently with these massive energy bills really brought some of that home. And this was a problem that was identified. We'd identified at BCPAC. And in fact, in the last couple of years, not when I was there, but that argument got brought forward to the Utilities Commission to try and set a specific rate for low income customers. And the commission rejected it based on the fact that it would be discriminatory against the other customer classes. And so this is a huge problem, right? Because what we see now is the use of this concept in order to achieve the opposite goal of what we really should be striving for. And this is how these concepts are really, like when we talk about systemic racism, we talk about the systems, this is exactly an example of that. And I was thinking about Terri Lynn's description of terra nullius, which of course was used to justify colonization based on the idea that there was nobody in these lands. The idea, essentially dehumanizing the Indigenous peoples who were here by not counting them. And it reminded me of something that I heard recently, which is that same type of mentality could be used to describe the way that we are treating the climate today. Instead of terra nullius, it's kind of climate nullius, right? That future generations who are going to have to deal with and pay for this problem, we're acting as if they won't exist or they don't exist. And that same type of thinking, I think, pervades a climate and in the same way we're colonizing, I guess, the future atmosphere and future generations' ability to deal with it. So there's clear justice issues there. There's lots of other examples, of course, in law that really clearly show this distinction and environmental racism and climate justice at play. For example, the maximum fine for dumping garbage or waste on Crown land, on the Queen's land, is up to $1 million and minimum of $2,000, excuse me. Meanwhile, that same maximum penalty for dumping waste or garbage on a reserve, which makes up 0.2% of the landmass in Canada, is $100. So just from that scale alone, you can see the different ways that these things are treated. And I unfortunately was, witness to a very clear and long example of that with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation's building of their new administration building. This is a building that is certified LEED, or sorry, is 2 LEED gold standards, not certified, and has solar panels powering it. Is really was built with this climate future in mind. And the project went way over budget for one primary reason, and that is that the hill that it was built upon was an artificial hill, was actually a hill that was the result of the dredging of False Creek for the building of the Expo 86 lands. And this fill that was dredged out, that was contaminated, was dumped onto the Tsleil-Waututh Reserve for very, very minimal compensation. And then became their responsibility to remediate and remove that contaminated soil before building their administration building. And as a result, the project went over budget, and it's the nation who's paying for it. There's so many examples that we can point to. I remember at the Utilities Commission working a First Nation coming to the commission because BC Hydro was building a transmission line directly through and basically on top of their community while they were still having to burn diesel in order to access electricity with these transmission lines overhead. A couple of pieces that I just wanted to comment on. The slides that Kathy showed that contrasted the total emissions with the per capita emissions, are really important to look at. And I know that there was a comment to this effect in the Q&A already. But the reality is that those per capita emissions actually probably understate the real impact of Canadian emissions in particular. And when we think about places like China or India or Bangladesh, which have large populations and relatively large absolute numbers, although small per capita numbers, that also doesn't tell the whole story, because of course we have outsourced in the West, by and large, our emissions by moving manufacturing to these other jurisdictions. And so not only are we outsourcing the manufacturing, but the emissions themselves for the goods that largely are consumed by global North and West countries are actually not counted properly. So there are so many examples that we can point to. In the interest of time, I do want to just kind of wrap up here quickly, and I really look forward to more of a conversation. But I also want to just mention, because we need, if we're talking about solutions and how to move forward, a current private members bill that is before the federal government. It's called Bill C-230, and it's a national strategy to redress Environmental Racism Act. This is an example of the way that we can start to address systemic racism, to address climate justice and environmental racism through legal tools. This act would require the government to examine the link between race, socioeconomic status, and environmental risk, collect information and statistics relating to these to environmental hazards and negative health outcomes, and basically put in place measures to meaningfully address it. And so there is lots of amazing work happening around the world that I feel very lucky to be connected to. But at the end of the day, this is all of our problem. And any solution to climate change that doesn't center justice, that is not a climate justice focused approach, has the real risk not only of making things, but keeping things bad, but in fact making them worse for those who are already impacted disproportionately by colonization. And so I hope that we can have a nice conversation after this. And I want to thank you for your time, and thank you again to the organizers for the invitation.
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks so much for that wonderful overview and all the stories based on your experience. And really appreciate you drawing our attention to that private members bill. And I know that there's more information about that on West Coast Environmental Law's site. So that's one place you can go for more information on that. And of course, on Eugene's other work with TMX and many other topics. So now we are moving on. We've had the 4 talks. Eugene gets 1 question, just like the other panelists did. And I'm going to pick the top question and pose it to him, and then also turn it over to the other panelists. We have quite the legal crowd here and political science. And the question, and I thought this was actually a very good question, especially when I think about those incredibly graphic slides that Terri showed us from Niger about the severe oil pollution that has gone unchecked for so many years there. And just thinking about people drinking the oil water, as he said, or having their children play in that oil water. So the question is, for Eugene first, and then maybe over to the other panelists, what role do you see for the International Court of Justice to hold accountable the main carbon emitters, whether multinational companies or whole countries?
Good question. So, I mean, I see a role in international law and particularly the International Court of Justice in weighing in on these discussions. I don't think that those alone are going to get us there. It's my view that we need a multitude of tools and approaches. What I'm kind of following with interest, for example, the cases against Exxon in the U.S. where there was active denial of the reality of climate change in spite of their own recognition internally of it. And so for me, the question is, what in this moment we're in today, where we recognize hopefully the threat, or at least we are starting to on a political level, at least that it exists, maybe perhaps not the scale or urgency. With that knowledge and the actions that we take, I think it would be super interesting to see how that might play out in that forum. I also think that we need to be moving on multiple fronts and can't just rely on that. I think international law has had some challenges, of course, in impact and enforcement. But it's these standards, and I think the connection ultimately that's important, because we can't keep just thinking about this. This is such a huge problem that not only can it not be solved on the individual or local or national levels, that it is an international problem ultimately. And it really makes it clear the legal fiction of borders and the fact that not only climate but pollution does not respect those or really understand them.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we heard that pretty clearly from everybody, and Terri Lynn addressed it quite clearly in her, what's the point of, well, not what's the point, you want to get the title, but title to marine spaces without marine species is not really the goal. Do other panelists want to address that question about the role for the International Court of Justice? Terri, looks like we have a take from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. That was great. So, international law, I usually call it, to a large extent, is a toothless bulldog when it comes to certain matters. International law, if you look at the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, it has jurisdiction on 2 major areas. One, cases that are referred by states themselves. So when states, maybe lodge a complaint or they have a disagreement, maybe about borders and all that. So there was a time Nigeria had one with Cameroon. They went to the International Court of Justice. The second scenario where you can take a case to the International Court of Justice is when other UN agencies refer cases to the International Court of Justice. Now, if you look at the two scenarios, the only one that may be a little feasible is when a state refers a case to the ICJ. But then, if you remember during my presentation, right, one of the culprits of climate injustice is the nation state. So governments are actually also cooperating with corporations to cause climate injustice and environmental injustice. So that becomes problematic, right? If the person that is supposed to take report a case is one of the culprits. So rather than, so I'm not very hopeful that the ICJ will change anytime soon or will make anything happen. But alternatively, what could work is transnational litigation. So Linda sent me a couple of news releases about cases that were successful in other countries. So for instance, there was a recent case that was successful in the Netherlands, one of the cases of the Niger Delta. So we have similar cases around. So what would be more interesting is seeing people that are that want to help the cause within industrialized countries, who then partner with, maybe NGOs in Africa or communities in Africa to sue those corporations in their homes. So that would work better than, maybe taking cases to International Court of Justice. So yeah, that's what I think.
Great, thank you. I think I'd like to, at this point, ask the panelists if they'd like to comment on each other's presentations or pose a question to another panelist before going back to the Q&A. Is there any panelist who would like to ask or comment on another panelist's presentation? And I'm happy to go back to the Q&A if that, because we've got lots of good ones. There's one here that's got top votes about whether it's better to use climate crisis or climate emergency rather than climate change, given the severity of the crisis we're experiencing. Does anyone want to comment on the language issue or, again, pose a question to each other? And I invite all the panelists to put their video back on so we can see you in these last 10 minutes. What do you think about the climate emergency wording?
I'll chime in here while others are jumping in. Yeah, I think language matters. One of the things that I was actually just reflecting on yesterday with some folks was how much time has been lost on this fight because there was a perhaps naive view within the environmental sector and climate policy and scientists and so on that all we needed was the truth to educate people, and then the truth would set them free, and we would get to where we need to go. I wrote a paper right after the Kyoto Protocol was signed in my undergrad at UBC a long time ago. And I remember the main thesis was essentially that the targets they've set are not adequate to meet the current science, but what's important is that we have international cooperation. 20 years later, that seems quite, unfortunately, just quite disappointing that we're basically in the same cycle. So I do think that language that captures the scale of the problem and the time frame, crisis or emergency, does work because people need, we need to actually move to act more quickly because of the essentially new version of climate denial, which is inadequate solutions like unproven technologies that they're relying on.
Kathy.
Absolutely, and I think old habits die hard, and I tend to say climate change and then sometimes say emergency or crisis instead. I think, building on what Eugene said, one of the other things we need to realize is who people are hearing from. And politics is a team sport. And so if those of us who are concerned about the climate crisis use different words, we're using them with each other, but the folks who are concerned about their jobs in the fossil fuel industry and getting their messages from the Conservative Party aren't necessarily hearing those words, or are hearing them with different meaning attached to them. So some research I've done on public opinion on carbon pricing, one of the things we find is that people's understanding of basic facts are very different depending on which party they support in Canadian politics. So people are getting their language and getting their messages from different parties. So until we have those different terms being used in a more widespread way, they're not going to solve our problems for us.
I guess I'll just jump in and say that I agree that it is a crisis, of course, but also I worry that a lot of people turn off when they hear of this big, massive problem that maybe they don't have an ability to help fix. And so I really encourage local discussions that really examine what the impacts are that really impact each person, and working to address those issues that way, and really bringing it home that way. And that's where, of course, Indigenous peoples have knowledge to share and can participate in that discussion about what the climate crisis means to each of us.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pick a final question here and would love all of you to respond. It is in the Q&A, but it is also one of the priority areas for action expressed in the UBC Climate Emergency Task Force report. And it's about UBC's role. Terri touched on this, and you all have UBC connections. The recommendation in the Climate Emergency Task Force, the broad priority area, is that UBC should demonstrate institutional leadership on climate justice. And there's a question in the chat about ways that UBC can use their platforms to address climate justice. So could I have each of you address that, please, as the final answer? Maybe we'll start, I'll call on you. Maybe we'll start with Terri, who I see on my screen to the right.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Linda. I mean, that's probably the top question on my mind, right? I love, brainstorming and talking about stuff, but what I like better is even action. So I've had some interaction with some UBC folks about this. There are a couple of ways UBC could come in, but I think the easiest is for UBC to use its existing platforms. So when I had this discussion with Professor Ono, he mentioned that there are some partnerships between UBC and some universities in Africa that they could use to address, climate issues in Africa. So I think there are existing platforms. It's just about how we prioritize it. As I've argued, right, that we're not going anywhere without Africa, for sure. And UBC, I mean, we all love the fact that UBC is being branded as the #1 university on climate action, right? I would love to see UBC then take a lead, right? If governments are not doing what they should be doing, if businesses, corporations are not doing what they should be doing to help Africa, universities at the forefront of innovation. So I would love to see UBC take a stand and then actually act on that stand by using some of the current initiatives they have at UBC. So whether those are partnerships that they have already or initiatives that are moving from UBC to address problems in Africa. So we have those on ground. So I would love to see UBC use those channels. Thank you.
Great. Terri Lynn.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to speak to this question. I'm not so immersed at UBC, but of course, there is a great role that UBC could play as an example in encouraging researchers like Terri to do great work on climate change. There could be additional grants to support that kind of work, or awards and scholarships, and just write down to everyday actions and the things that we do on UBC could have a great impact in helping to foster a new way of thinking about this issue and how we navigate our way through the crisis. It's an incredible forum that has great potential.
Thank you, Kathy.
So UBC is a teaching and research institution. And so I think that's where our biggest contributions can be, the research that we do, faculty and graduate students, and the courses we teach to, well, I don't know what the latest numbers are, close to 70,000 students. I think if we want to be serious about the climate emergency, and it's great that we're divesting from fossil fuels, we should. It's great that we're moving to carbon neutrality, absolutely we should. But if we want to get serious, we should hire a whole bunch more faculty who can teach courses and whose primary research is climate change from many disciplinary perspectives. As Terri Lynn suggested, create funding for graduate students who in increasing numbers want to focus on this. And with more faculty and more PhD students in particular, we could offer more courses to a large number of students. And that's what universities do. Yes, we have labs and we need to turn off the lights and have carbon neutrality in our flights and so on, but we need the research and we need the courses.
Thank you. And finally, Eugene.
Well, I agree with everyone else says, absolutely, around divestment, around the research and teaching. I guess the one thing that I'll add, if we're talking about climate justice, if we're talking about, access to justice questions, for me, that also includes access to education and information. And the reality is that with where tuitions are and the cost of living in Vancouver, that a lot of people who are probably the most impacted by climate issues are not able to pursue the formal education or tertiary education through institutions like UBC. So, there's solutions to that, of course, within helping to fund those, but ultimately, I actually think there's also a role as a public educator, as using the role, as a public institution that is trusted with multidisciplinary approach to talk about it in the public forum in a way that doesn't have the barriers that requires you to have a tuition or a certain language set even, right? I think that there's a big piece of access to information that includes, and lawyers are the worst at this, using unnecessarily complex language to deal with already complex issues. So that would be my only addition to what the other panelists have said. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great way to finish off for the responsibility of the institution. I know we're at time. I'd like to offer a huge thank you to our 4 panelists today for joining us and devoting their time to this discussion, sharing their thoughts and their stories. It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much. We're continuing to focus on climate justice this month at UBC. We have a UBC Sustainability Reads event next week, March 11th, with acclaimed Indian writer, novelist, and nonfiction writer Amitav Ghosh, talking about his book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Then on Friday, March 19th, we'll host another webinar, Moving from Grassroots to Government, with 4 elected leaders from across the Lower Mainland. That should be a really interesting discussion about how to influence elected leaders and how they put their own activism to work when they get into power. We also encourage you to visit the climateemergency.ubc.ca website. That report that I've referred to a few times, the Climate Emergency Task Force report, is posted there. And we are now going to be working on a resources page with resources on climate justice. We'd love your suggestions on what we should include on that page, and what types of materials you're interested in reading and learning more about, multimedia. And you can send an email to climate.emergency@ubc.ca or to me or anybody at the UBC Sustainability Initiative. Just 2 last things before we close. We are over time. Again, a thank you so much to the panelists. It's been such a pleasure to have you share your time with us today. We've really, really enjoyed it, and we are very grateful for your dedication. And I just would like to end, if I could, with a few words from the same poet who inspired the title of this webinar, Amanda Gorman. She's also a climate activist. She has a great poem. I urge you all to look it up. It's on YouTube. It's called Earthrise. It's about climate change. And I'm just going to end with a few words here. It tackles climate justice head on. We've known that we're caught in the throes of climactic changes. Some say we'll just go away, while some simply pray to survive another day. For it is the obscure, the oppressed, the poor, who, when the disaster is declared done, still suffer more than anyone. And while this is a training in sustaining the future of our planet, there is no rehearsal. The time is now, now, now. And that's just an excerpt. It's a beautiful poem with a lovely background of the Earth from space, what Amanda Gorman calls the pale blue dot. So thank you again, panelists. Thank you, participants, for joining us, and I hope you come back for more climate justice events later this month.
Thank you.